The sea had always held a certain allure for adventurers, a vast, uncharted wilderness that beckoned the brave and foolish alike. But there were places where even the most seasoned sailors dared not venture, waters whispered about in hushed tones, places where compasses spun wildly, and the air itself seemed cursed. One such place lay in the farthest reaches of the Atlantic, where the ocean floor was littered with the remains of ships that had met their untimely ends. This was the graveyard of the lost, a stretch of water so notorious that it had earned a place in maritime folklore as a place where the living were unwelcome. The journey began, as many ill-fated ones do, with a whispered rumor and a promise of untold treasures. It was in a dimly lit tavern on the coast of New England, where Martin Delaney, a veteran diver, first heard of the ship graveyard. The tale was told by an old sailor whose face was as weathered as the deck of an ancient galleon, his voice thick with the weight of too many years at sea. "They say there's a place where the dead ships lie," the old man rasped, his eyes glinting in the candlelight. "A place where the water's thick with the souls of sailors who never found their way home. Ships from every era, some so old they've turned to dust under the waves, others still intact, as if they went down just yesterday. But it's not just the wrecks you need to worry about. It's what lingers around them." Martin listened intently, his interest piqued. He had spent years diving in some of the most treacherous waters in the world, searching for sunken treasure and relics of lost civilizations. But this was something different. This was a challenge, a mystery that had yet to be solved. The idea of exploring a forgotten graveyard of ships untouched by time was too tempting to resist. "Where is this place?" Martin asked, leaning closer. The old sailor hesitated, his gaze drifting to the darkened windows as if expecting something, or someone to be watching. He lowered his voice to a near whisper. "Far out in the Atlantic, beyond the fishing grounds where the water's black as night. You'll need a skilled crew and nerves of steel. Many have gone there, but few have returned to tell the tale." Martin's pulse quickened with a mix of excitement and unease. He knew the dangers of deep-sea diving, the risks of venturing into uncharted waters where anything could happen. But the lure of discovery, the possibility of uncovering something truly remarkable, was too strong to ignore. A week later, Martin stood on the deck of the Sea Witch, a sturdy diving vessel he had chartered for the expedition. The crew he had assembled were among the best, seasoned divers and oceanographers who had faced countless dangers in the deep. Yet, as they prepared to set sail, a strange tension hung in the air, as if the very sea itself was warning them to turn back. The sun was setting as they departed, casting an eerie golden light over the water. The waves lapped gently against the hull, and the ship's engine hummed steadily, cutting through the gathering darkness. Martin stood at the bow, watching as the coastline slowly disappeared from view, replaced by an endless expanse of water. The journey was uneventful at first, the sea calm and the skies clear. But as they ventured further from land, the atmosphere began to change. The air grew colder, the sky darkening with thick rolling clouds that seemed to materialize out of nowhere. The crew exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke of their growing apprehension. On the third day, as they neared the coordinates provided by the old sailor, a dense fog rolled in, shrouding the ship in a thick, suffocating mist. Visibility dropped to near zero, and the temperature plummeted. The crew worked in silence, their movements slow and deliberate, as if the fog had seeped into their bones. It was then that the strange occurrences began. The first sign was a faint, distant sound, like the tolling of a bell, deep and mournful, carried on the wind. At first, Martin thought it was just his imagination, a trick of the mind in the oppressive gloom. But the sound grew louder, more distinct, echoing across the water as if calling to them. Do you hear that? One of the crewmen, a burly diver named Tom, asked, his voice tight with unease. Martin nodded, his hand tightening on the railing. A bell, but there's no land or buoys out here. The sound was joined by another, a low, guttural moan that seemed to rise from the depths below. The fog swirled around them, thickening until it was almost suffocating. The ship's instruments began to malfunction, compasses spinning wildly, depth gauges flickering erratically. "We're close," Martin muttered to himself, a sense of dread settling in his gut. Too close. And then, as suddenly as it had descended, the fog began to lift, revealing a sight that made the breath catch in Martin's throat. Looming out of the water, barely visible in the fading light, were the dark silhouettes of dozens of ships, their masts broken, their hulls half submerged in the water. Some were ancient, their wood rotted and crumbling, while others looked almost new, as if they had been claimed by the sea only recently. This was it, the graveyard of the lost. But as they drifted closer, Martin could feel it in his bones. This was no ordinary ship graveyard. There was something malevolent here, something ancient and angry waiting beneath the surface. The sea was still, too still, as if holding its breath, and the air was heavy with the scent of salt and decay. "Prepare the diving gear," Martin ordered, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. "We're going in." As the crew moved to obey, Martin took one last look at the silent, ghostly ships surrounding them. He'd come in search of history, of forgotten treasures and the stories of the men who had sailed these waters. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first diver slipped into the water, he couldn't shake the feeling that they had just crossed a threshold, a point of no return, and the sea, with all its secrets, was ready to claim them. The sea was as black as ink when the first diver, Tom, slipped into the water, the splash swallowed by the vast, silent void around them. The only light came from the divers' flashlights, piercing thin beams through the darkness, illuminating swirling particles and the occasional drifting shadow. Martin watched from the edge of the boat, his stomach churning with a mix of excitement and dread as he prepared to follow. "Visibility's poor," Tom's voice crackled through the comms, distorted by the pressure and static. "Can barely see a few feet ahead." "Stay close," Martin replied, double-checking his gear. His heart thudded in his chest, a steady rhythm against the eerie stillness of the ocean. He glanced at the rest of the crew, their faces hidden behind their masks, but he could feel their tension mirroring his own. One by one, they entered the water, the cold shock of it seeping through their wetsuits as they descended into the abyss. The world above vanished almost immediately, swallowed by the inky blackness, leaving only the faint glow of their lights and the sound of their breathing. The pressure mounted as they went deeper, the water pressing against them like an unseen force, reminding them that they were far from home. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the silence became, broken only by the occasional creak of a distant wreck or the faint, haunting moan of the ocean. Martin's light swept across the murky water, catching glimpses of twisted metal, shattered wood, and the bleached bones of long-dead sailors half buried in the sand. The wrecks were everywhere, a jumbled mess of history lost to the sea, each one telling a story of disaster and despair. "There's something down here." Tom's voice cut through the static, low and wary. His light had caught on something massive in the distance, a hulking shape rising from the seabed like a monolith. The rest of the team adjusted their course, swimming toward the structure. As they drew closer, the shape resolved into the wreck of a once grand vessel, its bow pointed skyward, as if frozen in a desperate attempt to breach the surface one last time. The name on the side was barely legible, the letters worn away by time and the relentless assault of the sea. The Seraphine. Must be at least 2 centuries old, another diver, Elena, whispered over the comms. Look at the size of it. Martin nodded, even though none of them could see it. The ship was enormous, its sides encrusted with barnacles and seaweed, its masts long since snapped off and claimed by the ocean. He swam closer, the beam of his light tracing the outlines of the ship's deck, where rusted cannons still pointed out toward the endless dark. Spread out, Martin instructed. We need to document everything. The team fanned out, their lights flickering over the wreck as they began their survey. Martin moved toward the bow, drawn by a strange compulsion, a sense that something important lay within the ship's shattered remains. He reached the front of the ship, where the figurehead, a winged angel, had been reduced to little more than a crumbling, hollow-eyed statue. As he moved to enter the ship, a sudden chill ran down his spine. He froze, glancing around, but saw nothing except the dark void pressing in around them. Yet the feeling persisted, a sense of being watched, of something ancient and unseen observing their every move. Anyone else feel that? Martin asked, his voice barely a whisper. Feel what? Elena's voice came back, tinged with confusion. Like we're not alone down here. There was a pause, filled only by the soft hiss of their breathing and the distant creaks and groans of the wrecks around them. It's just your nerves, Martin, Tom said, though he didn't sound convinced. This place would spook anyone. Martin tried to shake off the unease and continued his descent into the ship's interior. The narrow corridors were choked with debris, the walls covered in a thick layer of silt. Every movement sent clouds of it swirling into the water, further reducing visibility. He passed through what had once been the crew's quarters, where rusted bed frames and tattered remnants of uniforms lay in eerie disarray. A shattered lantern lay in the corner, its glass long broken and nearby. The skeletal remains of a sailor, still clutching a rusted locket in its bony fingers. A sudden flicker of movement caught Martin's eye. He turned quickly, his light sweeping across the narrow space, but there was nothing. Only the endless dark and the silent, waiting wreckage. Let's keep moving, he muttered, trying to push down the rising sense of dread. But deep within the wreck, the shadows seemed to thicken, and the cold, unseen presence lingered, watching, waiting, biding its time as the divers ventured deeper into the heart of the ghostly ship graveyard. The water grew colder as the divers moved deeper into the ship graveyard, the temperature dropping with each stroke of their fins. The thick darkness seemed to close in around them, their flashlights carving only narrow tunnels of visibility through the oppressive blackness. Martin led the team forward, trying to ignore the increasing weight of dread pressing down on him. As they swam between the wrecks, the scale of the graveyard became apparent. There were dozens of ships, their twisted, decaying hulls stacked atop one another in a chaotic jumble. Some were ancient, their wood splintering and crumbling away, while others were more recent, their metal corroded but still intact. It was as if the ocean had claimed them all, regardless of time or origin, binding them together in this watery tomb. The divers moved cautiously, their lights flickering over the rusted remnants of forgotten voyages. Tom drifted near the skeletal remains of a schooner, its mast leaning precariously, barely attached to the shattered deck. Elena swam close to a half-buried submarine, its once mighty steel hull now pocked with holes, an eerie silence emanating from its open hatches. Then, there was a sound, a faint, distant whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Martin halted, signaling the others to stop. The whisper grew louder, the words indistinct, like voices carried on the wind, garbled by the water. He strained to listen, but the meaning eluded him. "You hear that?" Tom's voice crackled through the comms, filled with unease. "I hear it," Martin replied, his pulse quickening. "Everyone stay close." The whispering intensified, rising and falling in a rhythmic pattern, like the chant of a ghostly crew. It echoed through the water, reverberating off the sunken ships, making it impossible to tell where it originated. The divers exchanged uneasy glances, the ghostly sounds fraying their nerves. Suddenly, Elena's light caught on something just ahead, and she signaled frantically to the others. Martin and Tom swam over, their beams illuminating the source of her distress. There, floating just above the deck of a ship that had gone down decades earlier, was a figure, a pale, translucent silhouette, swaying gently in the current. Martin's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the apparition. It was the ghostly form of a sailor, his features blurred, but his eyes, those dark, hollow eyes, were fixed on the divers. The specter's mouth moved as if speaking, but no sound came, only the haunting whispers that filled the water around them. "Is that a ghost?" Tom's voice trembled with disbelief. Before Martin could respond, the figure began to drift closer, its movements slow and deliberate. The water around them seemed to thrum with a deep, resonant pulse, a heartbeat from the depths. The otherworldly sound grew louder, reverberating through the divers' suits, and with it, a feeling of intense, suffocating dread. "Back away slowly," Martin ordered, trying to keep his voice steady. "Don't provoke it." But as they began to retreat, more figures began to emerge from the wrecks, their ghostly forms rising from the twisted metal and rotting wood. They floated silently, their eyes fixed on the intruders, their bodies swaying with the current as if tethered to the ships that had claimed their lives. The divers were surrounded now, the spectral crew closing in from all sides. Panic surged through Martin as he realized they were trapped in the midst of a ghostly fleet, each spirit bound to the wrecks that had become their graves. The water was thick with their presence, an oppressive, suffocating force that pressed in on all sides. "Get out of here now!" Martin shouted, but the command was lost in the chaos. The ghosts began to move faster, their forms blurring as they reached out with translucent hands. Martin felt a cold, spectral touch graze his arm, a chill that pierced through his suit and straight into his bones. It wasn't just the cold. It was the overwhelming sense of despair, of a life cut short, that flooded through him, leaving him gasping for breath. The divers kicked hard, desperately trying to break free from the circle of ghosts. But the spirits followed, their whispers growing louder, more insistent, as if pleading for something. The water churned with their restless energy, and the wrecks around them groaned and shifted, as if the sea itself was waking from a long, dark slumber. Martin's heart pounded as he swam toward the surface, the ghostly figures fading into the darkness below. But the whispers stayed with him, echoing in his mind, a chilling reminder that they were not alone in these depths. The haunted fleet, with its cursed crew, had marked them, and as they emerged from the water, gasping for air, Martin knew that the graveyard's hold on them was far from over. The divers surfaced, gasping for breath, their hearts pounding in sync with the terror that gripped them. Martin clung to the side of the Sea Witch, his knuckles white as he hoisted himself up and onto the deck. His wet suit was cold and clammy against his skin, but it was nothing compared to the icy dread that had settled in his chest. The others scrambled aboard, their eyes wide, their faces pale behind their masks. No one spoke for a moment. The night had deepened, and the sky above was a dark, starless void. The sea was unnervingly calm, as if the very ocean was holding its breath. Only the distant creak of the ship and the quiet sloshing of water against the hull broke the oppressive silence. What the hell was that?" Tom finally gasped, his voice shaky as he ripped off his mask. "Did we just see ghosts?" Martin didn't answer immediately. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of what they had just experienced. But the more he thought about it, the more impossible it seemed. Ghosts were the stuff of legends, of sailors' tales meant to frighten those who dared to challenge the sea. And yet, the cold touch on his arm still lingered, a tangible proof that something beyond explanation had happened down there. "I don't know," Martin replied, his voice hoarse. "But whatever it wasn't natural." Elena, who had been silent since they surfaced, suddenly grabbed Martin's arm. Her eyes were wide with fear. "Did you feel it too? That despair? It was like they were trying to show us something. Make us feel what they felt." Martin nodded grimly. "It was more than just a presence. It was a memory. A piece of their pain. Whatever those things were, they're tied to those ships and they're suffering." Tom shuddered, rubbing his arms as if trying to shake off the cold. "So what do we do now? We can't just go back down there with them waiting." "We have to," Martin said, surprising even himself with the firmness in his voice. "We came here to uncover the secrets of this place, and now we know it's more than just a graveyard. It's a prison and those spirits are trapped." The crew exchanged uneasy glances. The thought of descending back into the haunted depths was terrifying, but they had come too far to turn back now. Martin could see the determination in their eyes, tempered by fear but not consumed by it. "Then we need to be careful," Elena said, her voice steadying. "If those spirits are bound to the ships, there has to be something tying them there, something that keeps them from moving on." Martin nodded, his mind already racing with possibilities. The wrecks themselves could be anchors, but there's something else, something specific that holds the strongest ties. We need to find out what it is, and if we can break it. They spent the next hour preparing for another dive, checking their gear with meticulous care. The tension was thick in the air, each of them aware that the next descent could be even more dangerous than the first. But the fear also sharpened their focus, pushing them to be thorough, to leave nothing to chance. As they suited up, Martin's thoughts returned to the spectral crew they had encountered. The way they moved, the way their eyes had locked onto the divers with a mix of longing and despair, was unsettling. These were not mindless apparitions. They were aware, conscious of their plight, and perhaps even desperate for release. Finally, with everything in place, Martin gave the order to proceed. One by one, they slipped back into the cold, dark water, the surface closing over their heads like the lid of a coffin. The moment they were submerged, the oppressive silence returned, broken only by the sound of their breathing and the steady thrum of the ship above. The descent was slow and methodical, their lights sweeping the depths as they returned to the heart of the graveyard. The wrecks loomed out of the darkness, silent sentinels guarding the secrets of the deep. But this time, Martin could feel the difference, an almost palpable tension in the water, as if the spirits knew they were coming. They reached the wreck of the Seraphine, its ghostly form partially illuminated by the flickering beams of their lights. The temperature dropped even further, the cold biting into their suits as they moved cautiously along the deck. And then they appeared. The spectral crew materialized out of the shadows, their forms barely more than wisps of light and darkness. But their eyes, those hollow, despairing eyes, were fixed on the divers, watching their every move. The whispers began again, growing louder, more insistent, like a chorus of mournful voices echoing through the water. Martin could feel the spirits pressing closer, their presence suffocating. But he forced himself to stay calm, to remember why they were here. They needed answers, and the only way to get them was to confront the very beings who haunted this place. He held up a hand, signaling the others to stop. The whispers swirled around them, growing louder, and for a moment Martin thought he could almost understand the words. A plea, a warning, or perhaps a curse. "We're not here to hurt you," Martin whispered into his calm, unsure if the spirits could even hear him. "We just want to know what happened to you. Why you're still here." The response was immediate. The spectral forms surged forward, their cold, ghostly hands reaching out. And suddenly, Martin wasn't in the wreck anymore. He was aboard the Seraphine, the deck solid beneath his feet, the smell of salt and gunpowder thick in the air. Around him, the crew bustled with frantic energy, their faces twisted with fear as they worked to keep the ship afloat in the midst of a violent storm. And then, a blinding flash, an explosion that ripped through the night, tearing the ship apart. Martin felt the shockwave, the searing heat, the icy plunge into the black water as the ship went down. The screams of the dying crew echoed in his ears, their terror mingling with his own as the darkness swallowed them whole. In an instant, it was over. Martin was back in the present, the wreck of the Seraphine around him, the spectral crew hovering in the water, their eyes pleading, desperate for release. He understood now. They were reliving their final moments, trapped in an endless loop of death and despair, bound to the wreck by the very force of their tragedy. And as long as the wreck remained, so would they, caught between life and death, forever haunted by the past. What could they do to break the cycle? Martin's thoughts raced as the spirits circled them, their mournful whispers growing more intense. There had to be something they could do to sever the ties that held these souls captive. But time was running out, and the spirits were growing restless. The water churned around them, and the wrecks groaned and shifted, as if the graveyard itself was waking up, ready to drag them down into its depths. Martin had to think fast. They needed to find whatever was binding the spirits to this place, and destroy it, before the graveyard claimed them too. The temperature in the water continued to drop, numbing the divers as they drifted among the wrecks. The spectral crew's whispers had grown into a cacophony of anguish, an overwhelming surge of sorrow and desperation. Martin knew they were running out of time. The spirits were growing more agitated, their presence pressing in on the divers with an intensity that was becoming unbearable. "We need to find the source," Martin muttered into his calm, trying to keep his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "Something's tying them here. Something specific. We need to find it and destroy it." Elena's voice crackled through the static. "Maybe it's something on the Seraphine. That ship. It felt different from the others." Martin agreed. The Seraphine was older, more decayed, and yet it seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy that the other wrecks lacked. If there was anything binding the spirits to this place, it had to be there. He motioned for the team to follow him as he swam toward the ship, the others close behind, their lights cutting through the dark water. They reached the bow of the Seraphine, its ghostly figurehead looming out of the shadows like a sentinel guarding the dead. Martin steeled himself as he moved toward the shattered entrance to the captain's quarters. The door was barely hanging on its hinges, the wood warped and splintered, but it gave way easily as he pushed it open. Inside, the quarters were eerily preserved, as if time had stopped the moment the ship went down. The furniture was intact, though coated with a thick layer of silt, and the remnants of a tattered map lay spread across a desk, pinned beneath a rusted compass. But it was the captain's log that caught Martin's eye, resting at the center of the desk as though it had been waiting for them. Martin hesitated before reaching for the log. It felt wrong, intrusive, as if he were disturbing something sacred, or cursed. But they had no choice. This could be the key to understanding what had happened here. He opened the log carefully, the pages crumbling slightly at the edges. The ink was faded but still legible, the handwriting neat and precise. As Martin began to read, the story of the Seraphine unfolded before him, the captain's words painting a picture of a voyage that had started with high hopes but had quickly descended into disaster. The final entries were filled with desperation. The captain wrote of a terrible storm, one that had come out of nowhere, battering the ship with monstrous waves and howling winds. The crew had fought valiantly to keep the ship afloat, but it was as if the sea itself had turned against them. The last entry sent a shiver down Martin's spine. We are lost. The storm shows no mercy. I fear we are doomed to join the souls claimed by these cursed waters. I have sealed our fate. Knowingly or not, I have led my men to their deaths. God forgive me. To those who find this, know that this place is cursed, a graveyard where the dead do not rest. May they find peace, though I fear they never will. A sudden coldness seeped through Martin's glove as he reached the final page. His hand trembled as he flipped it over, revealing a crude sketch, a map of the ship graveyard, with the Seraphine at its center. Around it, hastily drawn symbols marked spots on the ocean floor, symbols that Martin recognized from old maritime lore. They were wards, meant to bind, to trap. "Guys, I think I found it," Martin said, his voice tight. "The captain. He knew. He knew this place was cursed, and he marked it." "Marked it for what?" Tom asked, the unease clear in his tone. "To trap them," Martin replied, a realization dawning on him. "The spirits. The wards were supposed to bind them, keep them from harming others. But something went wrong. They're trapped here, but not at rest. They're reliving their deaths over and over." Elena swam closer, peering at the log over Martin's shoulder. "If those wards are the anchor, then we need to break them. It's the only way to set them free." Martin nodded, feeling a surge of urgency. They had to act quickly before the spirits grew too restless to control. "We'll start with the one near the Seraphine. It's the strongest. If we break it, the others might weaken enough for them to move on." He carefully tore the map from the log, the brittle paper nearly disintegrating in his hands. The others gathered around, their faces grim but determined. They knew what was at stake. "Let's do this," Martin said, his voice firm. "We break the anchor, and we get out." With the map in hand, they left the captain's quarters, the ghostly presence of the crew lingering around them like a cold mist. The whispers followed them, growing more frantic, more pleading, as if the spirit sensed what they were about to do. The team swam down to the spot marked on the map, just beneath the wreck of the Seraphine. The ocean floor was thick with silt, and as they cleared it away, the symbols carved into the rock were revealed, faint but unmistakable. Martin reached out, his hand trembling as he brushed away the last of the silt. The moment his fingers touched the symbols, a surge of energy rippled through the water, as if the entire graveyard had taken a breath. The whispers turned into a wail, a cry of release, of pain and joy intertwined. Martin closed his eyes and pressed down hard, breaking the symbols, shattering the ward that had bound the spirits for so long. The wail grew louder, echoing through the water, before fading away into a deep, resonant silence. When Martin opened his eyes, the symbols were gone, dissolved into the ocean floor. The cold presence of the spirits was lifting, the oppressive weight that had filled the graveyard dissipating like mist in the morning sun. "It's done," Martin whispered, his voice barely audible through the comms. The spectral crew was gone. The spirits that had haunted the wrecks, that had plagued the divers, were finally at peace. The graveyard was silent, the water calm, as if the sea itself had let out a long-held sigh. But Martin knew they weren't safe yet. The graveyard's hold might be broken, but the ocean was still a treacherous place, and the surface was a long way up. "Let's get out of here," he said, his voice steady but urgent, "before the sea decides it wants to keep us too." And as they began their ascent, the haunted wrecks below them faded into the darkness, the ghosts of the past finally laid to rest. The weight of the water pressed down on them as they began their ascent, leaving the haunted wrecks and the broken ward behind. Martin led the team upward, his heart pounding not only from the exertion, but also from the lingering tension. Though they had broken the curse that bound the spirits, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching, waiting. The ascent was slow and methodical, every meter bringing them closer to the safety of the Sea Witch. The water around them remained eerily calm, the oppressive cold beginning to ease. But the silence was unsettling. The ghostly whispers that had plagued them earlier were gone, yet the absence of sound only heightened the tension. Martin's mind raced with the events that had just unfolded. They had freed the spirits, but at what cost? The ocean was an unpredictable force, and there was no telling how it might react to the disturbance they had caused. The curse had been lifted, but the graveyard was still a place of death, a watery tomb that had claimed countless lives. "Stay close," Martin said into the comms, his voice steady despite the dread gnawing at him. "We're almost there." The others acknowledged his command, their lights bobbing in the water as they followed him up. The surface felt tantalizingly close, yet still impossibly far. Every inch gained was a victory, every kick of their fins a reminder of the peril that still lurked beneath. Suddenly, a faint tremor rippled through the water, subtle at first, but growing stronger. Martin paused, his instincts screaming that something was wrong. The others halted as well, their beams of light converging on him. "Did you feel that?" Tom's voice crackled through the comms, the unease in his tone unmistakable. Martin didn't respond immediately. His senses were on high alert, his mind racing as he tried to determine the source of the disturbance. The water around them seemed to pulse, a low thrum that resonated deep within his bones. It was as if the ocean itself was awakening, reacting to the broken curse in a way none of them had anticipated. And then, from the darkness below, a low, guttural moan began to rise, a sound unlike anything they had heard before. It was deep and resonant, a mournful cry that seemed to echo from the very depths of the abyss. The water vibrated with the sound, sending chills down Martin's spine. "Keep moving," Martin ordered, the urgency in his voice unmistakable. "We need to reach the surface now." They resumed their ascent, but the moan grew louder, more insistent, as if something massive was stirring below. The tremors intensified, the water churning as unseen forces shifted in the deep. Martin pushed himself harder, his lungs burning with the effort as he fought to keep the panic at bay. And then, the water around them began to shift, swirling as if caught in a powerful current. Martin's heart lurched as he realized what was happening. The graveyard wasn't just a collection of wrecks. It was alive and it was angry. The curse they had broken had unleashed something far older and more dangerous than the spirits they had freed. The current tugged at them, pulling them back down toward the darkness. The surface was so close, but the ocean wasn't ready to let them go. Martin's muscles screamed in protest as he fought against the pull, his mind focused on one thing: survival. "Don't stop!" Martin shouted into the comms, his voice barely audible over the roar of the water. "We're almost there!" The others struggled alongside him, their movements frantic as they battled the force dragging them down. The moan had turned into a deafening roar, the water swirling in a vortex that threatened to consume them all. Martin's mind raced. He knew they had seconds, maybe less, to break free. The surface was a shimmering mirage above them, so close yet so far. He kicked with all his might, urging his body to defy the crushing pressure, to reach the light that promised safety. And then, with a final desperate push, Martin broke through the surface, gasping for air as the cold night sky came into view. The roar of the vortex below was still deafening, but he had made it. He glanced around, seeing the others emerge one by one, their faces pale and eyes wide with terror. The Sea Witch was just ahead, the crew on board shouting and reaching out to pull them from the water. Martin swam toward the boat with the last of his strength, the vortex below still churning, as if the graveyard itself was trying to reclaim them. They were dragged aboard, cold and shivering, but alive. The crew quickly hauled in the others, their faces a mix of relief and disbelief. Martin collapsed onto the deck, his chest heaving as he stared up at the night sky. The roar from below was fading, the ocean settling back into its eerie calm. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the lapping of water against the hull and the distant echoing moan of the graveyard finally settling into its rest. Martin sat up, his mind still reeling from the ordeal. The graveyard had let them go, but it had been a close call. Too close. He looked at his team, their faces haggard but alive, and felt a surge of relief. They had survived, but the memory of those last moments would haunt them forever. "We did it," Elena whispered, her voice trembling. "We actually did it." Martin nodded slowly, though the victory felt hollow. They had freed the spirits, but in doing so, they had awakened something far more ancient, a force that had nearly claimed them. The graveyard would remain, a place of death and mystery, but its curse was broken. "We did," Martin agreed, his voice low. "But let's get out of here. This place, it's not done with us yet." The crew quickly prepared to depart, the engine of the Sea Witch roaring to life. As they pulled away from the graveyard, Martin took one last look at the dark, foreboding water. The wrecks were hidden below, shrouded in the depths, but the memory of what they had experienced would stay with him forever. The sea was calm now, but Martin knew that it held secrets far darker and deeper than anyone could imagine. They had escaped the abyss, but the ocean had its own will, and it was never truly at peace. As the Sea Witch sailed toward the distant lights of the shore, Martin couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed them, something unseen that lingered in the depths, watching, waiting for the next soul to venture too close to the graveyard of the lost.